In a recent video, we talked about how the Clone Wars were a perfect Jedi trap, a conflict engineered to weaken Jedi so they could be easily killed. War, we explained, had a deleterious effect on Jedi. It weakened their connection to the Force and left them much more vulnerable than they otherwise would be. The Jedi were well aware of this going into the Clone Wars, so why did they choose to fight at all? Why did they walk into the trap the Sith had laid out for them? Were they just stupid, or was something else at play? In this video, we'll be answering that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Jedi often get criticized for missing the obvious when it comes to the start of the Clone Wars. To us, the audience, it looks like they missed a ton of early warning signs that something nefarious was afoot. They adopted the Grand Army of the Republic despite the fact it was ordered by a long-dead Jedi who had no authorization to commission a clone army in the first place. They were well aware that the clone template was Jango Fett, and were also aware that Fett was working with Count Dooku, a Sith Lord. Dooku himself said outright that the Galactic Senate was under Sith control. How on earth did they not put two and two together? This line of criticism suffers from a lack of perspective. Unlike the audience, the Jedi were unaware that the Clone Wars were completely orchestrated by the Sith, and there were simpler explanations for some of the odd things they uncovered. Jango Fett wouldn't have been the first infamous bounty hunter to be hired by both allies of the Jedi and by Sith Lords, for example, while Dooku's story about a Sith Lord in the Senate would have seemed like an insane conspiracy theory meant to turn the Jedi against the Republic. In other cases, such as the highly suspicious case of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Jedi didn't really have a choice other than to just roll with it and hope for the best. They had their orders from the Senate, after all. But there's more behind the Jedi's seeming obliviousness. During his battle with Darth Sidious in the Senate chamber, Yoda himself came to realize why the Jedi had fallen so easily into the Sith's trap. And here's a brief snippet of that realization. The Sith had changed. The Sith had grown, had adapted, had invested 1,000 years intensive study into every aspect of not only the Force, but of Jedi law in itself, in preparation for exactly this day. The Sith had remade themselves. They had become new. While the Jedi had spent that same millennium training to refight the last war. Time for a quick history lesson. There were three major eras of warfare between the Jedi and Sith: the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, the Old Sith Wars of the 3000s BBY, and the New Sith Wars of the 1000s BBY. Each time, the Sith were different from those before. The Sith of the Great Hyperspace War were the rulers of an alien empire bent on conquering the Republic. The Sith of the Old Sith Wars were predominantly fallen Jedi seeking to imitate that empire, building successor states inspired by the original. The new Sith, unlike their predecessors, operated as disjointed kingdoms and cults, and their empire was more of a patchwork of territories. By the time they were supposedly vanquished, the new Sith had reorganized into the Brotherhood of Darkness, which was essentially a dark side version of the Jedi Order. But even as the Sith had changed over the millennia, they stayed the same in many ways. All Sith orders, even the Brotherhood of Darkness, had taken after the first Sith in one key respect. They waged wars of conquest against the Republic. The Sith had always sought to build empires, and as far as the Jedi knew, they had always done so in the open. From remote strongholds steeped in the shadow of the dark side, they had raised armies and unleashed them against the Republic, seeking to conquer the civilized galaxy. Additionally, the Sith had always been the enemies of the Republic. As those of you who watched our series on Republic history know, the Jedi Order had a much looser and more tenuous relationship with the Republic before the Sith became an issue. But the millennia of wars between the Republic and various Sith empires drove the Jedi into a much closer friendship with the galactic government. From the Great Hyperspace War to the New Sith Wars, every major war the Sith fought had been against the Republic. This led the Jedi, who had once been somewhat critical of the corrupt and oft-exploitative Republic, to become its most stalwart defenders. Constant war with the Sith led the Jedi to see the Republic as the embodiment of galactic civilization, which they had vowed to protect. After the Sith were believed vanquished after the end of the New Sith Wars, the Jedi immediately began preparations for their return. They closely studied the past wars with the Sith, identifying many of their own failures and attempting to correct them. They allowed the Order to be officially incorporated into the Republic judicial forces, placing themselves under Senate supervision. This brought them closer with the Republic than they had ever been before, which the Jedi Council believed would allow them to more effectively defend the Republic should the Sith rise again. The lead up to the Clone Wars involved many shocking revelations for the Jedi. They learned that Jedi Master Cypher Dyas had apparently ordered a clone army that the Separatists had allied with powerful corporate factions, and that those corporations had built a massive droid army. But to the Jedi, the most important revelation of all was that Count Dooku was a Sith Lord. This revelation was the reason why the Jedi went to war. After the first Battle of Geonosis, the Jedi believed that, in Yoda's words, the shroud of the dark side had fallen. In the decades since they became aware of the return of the Sith, they had wondered what the Sith's next move would be and how they would attempt to conquer the galaxy. With the outbreak of the Clone Wars, they believed they had their answer. The revelation that Dooku was a Sith Lord led the Jedi to the obvious conclusion that the Confederacy of Independent Systems was a Sith puppet organization. That, they believed, was all they needed to know. The Jedi saw the CIS as a new Sith Empire, albeit with a different facade from the former empires. To the Jedi, the Sith and their puppets had used the Separatist cause as a front to build a massive army with which to conquer the galaxy. With that in mind, the Jedi did what they had done every other time a Sith Empire attempted to conquer the galaxy. They took command of the Republic military and waged war to stop them. The Clone Wars seemed like a very black and white conflict to the Jedi. Yet again, they were defending civilization, as represented by the Republic, against a new Sith Empire. Until the very end of the conflict, they saw no reason to believe the Clone Wars were any different from previous Sith Wars. The Sith had never deviated from their usual formula before, and there was no evidence to suggest that they had done it in the Clone Wars. To their credit, the Jedi's approach to the Clone Wars was a meaningful improvement over their approach to past Sith Wars. In the past, the galaxy had suffered dearly because the Jedi hesitated to take decisive action the moment the Sith revealed themselves, but this wasn't the case in the Clone Wars. In fact, if the CIS really was just a new Sith Empire, we reckon the Jedi's quick and decisive approach to the Clone Wars could have saved billions of lives. The problem, of course, was that the Clone Wars weren't what they appeared to be. As we mentioned earlier, the Clone Wars were a Sith trap, and in more ways than one. Part of that trap involved making the conflict look like a new round of Sith Wars to the Jedi. Count Dooku deliberately revealed himself as a Sith, and his express intentions in doing so were to make the Jedi perceive the CIS as a new Sith Empire. The Sith wanted the Jedi to get involved in the Clone Wars so they could set a bait the Jedi couldn't resist. As a final thought, it's worth noting that the Sith didn't leave the Jedi any choice. The Sith had won the moment Palpatine became Supreme Chancellor. As we mentioned earlier, the Jedi were part of the Republic judicial forces, meaning they had no choice but to go to war if the Republic called on them. Even if the Jedi saw past the bait the Sith had laid out, they wouldn't have been allowed to stay neutral in the Clone Wars. If they tried to stay out of the fighting, they would have been branded traitors to the Republic and hunted down. The short answer to our opening question then is that the Jedi fought in the Clone Wars both because they had no choice and because the Clone Wars looked like a Sith war to them. But what do you think? Would you like to see new videos about the Sith Wars in the future? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.